Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. Um, my name is Jens, and I'm the co-founder of Caromia. And today I would like to talk to you about CSRD compliance, and more specifically, I would like to focus on the double materiality assessment and the question that we're getting often from people, which is about the stakeholder engagement. How do you organize this? Who do you involve? What are the tips and tricks? Do you need to involve everyone, etc., etc.? Like these are often very hot debated subjects at clients, and we thought it would be useful to organize a small webinar on this and to tackle and to demystify this topic as a whole. So without further ado, I will kick things off. But maybe first a quick reminder that there is a Q&A section, so you can actually leave all your questions in the chat, and I'll love to tackle them at the end in the last 5 minutes. If we still have time, I'd love to tackle them at the end of the session. So, voila. Let's dive right in. So, here, I'd like to zoom out before we zoom in on the nitty-gritty details. And I'd like to take a step back and look at the double materiality assessment as a whole and maybe re-clarify what a double materiality assessment is. And if you followed our previous webinar from last month, then you'll learned that we actually look at this from a funnel. And so for us, a double materiality assessment is actually quite similar to a funnel, with as a goal to define what your material topics are for your CSRD report. And in that funnel, in that process, you will actually engage with stakeholders to identify what is actually material for your business and what is not material for your business. And that's what we're going to focus on today. So we're not going to cover the entire funnel, but we're going to focus on the part in the middle, which is what is highlighted today on the screen. So if we jump right in, and if you would ask me, who do I involve in my stakeholder assessment, then I can give you an easy textbook list. And that's looking very similar to this one, which is having internal stakeholders involved, but also external stakeholders involved. So the idea is really that all of your stakeholders, all of the relevant stakeholders are taking part in your double materiality assessment. And so on the internal side, that's your employees, that's your management, that's typically certain experts within your organization, shareholders, although they might not be on internal, but they're often considered to be on that side. Basically, those are your internal stakeholders to involve. On the external side, the list can be a bit longer and can be going into many different directions. But typically, we see customers, suppliers, NGOs, communities, governments, scientists, and also certain experts, industry associations. So we have like a number of different types of stakeholders, and it will all depend on your business, on who you involve, and who you will kind of deprioritize. Now, for every customer, this is quite unique. So let me give a quick example of how you can reflect on this and how you can actually come to a good list of stakeholders to involve. Now, I like to eat chocolate, so I'm always keen on using a chocolate example. And so imagine that you're a chocolate manufacturer, that you're making chocolate. Then in order to identify your relevant stakeholders, we recommend to look at your value chain. And if you look at how chocolate gets produced, you know that and there's a process in order to make chocolate. There's packaging involved, there's transportation involved, distribution and sales, etc. So, but obviously this is a very long process, and there's a lot of different countries, regions, processes, steps involved. So how do you then narrow it down? Because you could practically involve thousands of people. So what we recommend is to look at those activities that actually have the highest impact. And if you're familiar with the process, which is called lifecycle assessment, then those processes or that kind of analysis will actually tell you that the highest environmental and social impact that you have as a chocolate manufacturer is in the chocolate production and more specifically on the cocoa side of things. So yes, you will have impact with the sugar that you use, yes, with the transportation that you have, but this is all marginal compared to the impact, both on an environmental and a social level, that you have when cocoa is involved. So that's where we would recommend to focus as a first priority. Now, if you look at the value chain of a chocolate company and we focus on cocoa, then this is kind of what it would look like. Starting off with farmers who are growing the beans that are basically getting transported and go to your factory where you make the chocolate, and then from there on you distribute again to the shops and to the consumers. Now, looking at this with what we know from the previous step, we know that the biggest impacts are happening with the cocoa production. So here on with the farmers and the local corporations collecting all the information at the factory level. And obviously consumers, they are very hard to ignore because consumers actually have a lot of impact on your business. So those would then typically be the stakeholders that you would want to involve. But then the question is like, how and who do we then involve exactly? Because those farmers, they are often in Middle West African countries. There is very little means to reach these people unless you physically go there. So it's quite hard to collect their inputs and their opinion, right? So then it might be easier to look at NGOs representing those farmers, or experts, local governments that can help in assessing the opinion or providing you with the opinion of those parties. So that's a bit how you can actually look at this process, how you can start to narrow it down and to come up with a good list of stakeholders to involve. So 2 tips: look at your value chain, but then also try to understand within your value chain where the biggest impact is, and try to find the best representatives for those different stakeholder groups to involve in your process. Now that you've identified who you want to involve, the question naturally comes like, how do you involve these people as part of your double materiality assessments? Well, we actually work with different methods, and each method has clear benefits and clear drawbacks. So let me quickly go over these 3 methods. So first we have surveys, then we have interviews, and then we have focus groups. So if we're starting off with surveys, then they're quite easy to organize. So the effort to organize a survey is quite low. And another positive of surveys is that you're able to reach quite a large audience. So you're able to collect input quite quickly from many different areas in the world, different stakeholders who are located just about anywhere if they have a connection. So the main drawback is that through a survey, you're not really able to make a strong connection with these people. So you're not really able to add a lot of context to the questions that you're asking. And often the accuracy on the scores and on the input that we collect is lower. So because you have less control on the environment and less control on the understanding of the question with your stakeholders. So that's why we'd like to give 2 tips when you organize a survey: is to try to adapt as much as possible to the expertise of a person, because you might be sending a survey to a certain expert or someone who has quite some knowledge about a certain topic. It would be good to capitalize on that. And the second tip that we'd like to give is to add context, because when you're going to be asking questions that are not always so straightforward, and especially in the context of, for example, the chocolate company, if you're going to be asking questions about pollution, that's not necessarily so obvious for a lot of stakeholders on why pollution is then so important in the value chain of chocolate manufacturing. So it's good to add levels of context so that people can more easily understand and then also properly assess all of these questions. The next method is interviews. And so interviews, they are really great to collect qualitative insights. So really get an understanding of how people think and how people reason based on the questions that you're asking. So they give a good insight on how people really look at your business and the impact that you might have. They're also really good for building relationships. So for those stakeholders that you really care about, it's good to have an interview and to also connect and get to know them better. Because if they are important to your business in one way or the other, it's important and it can be interesting to build that relationship and to really, really understand them better on how they look at things. So the main drawback is that interviews, they're quite time consuming because you do need to reach out. People will not always respond. It takes time to set things up. And an interview easily lasts a good hour. So it is quite time consuming, especially if you want to do a few. It will easily take a couple of days to get everyone in an interview. A tip that I can give when you are talking to a stakeholder is to go beyond the questions that you have typically prepared. So in order to really get an understanding of how people think, it's good to ask like, so this is very important to you, but would you care to explain why this is so? Why do you think that is? So those kind of extra questions will really trigger a conversation, and those insights are very relevant to capture and to feed into your DMA process. When we move on to the next and the last data collection method, then I can really say that I'm a big fan of focus groups. And they actually bring some of the best practices from the interviews to a higher level. Why? Because in a focus group, what will happen is that you will have different people giving opinions, but you will drive them to consensus. So discussions that are taking place in focus groups, they're often quite rich, and you're forcing people to bring perspective to their own points of view. So that's why they often generate very good insights. The main downside of focus groups is that they're quite time consuming because it's a multiplication of the efforts of an interview on trying to coordinate all of this, bringing all those people together. And since that they yield the best results when they're organized physically, you also have that as an extra constraint on top. But nonetheless, they're definitely worth it, in my opinion, to collect relevant inputs. Now, when you organize a focus group, what I could say is that it's good to collect individual opinions first. So imagine that you have 5 or 10 people joining into a focus group. It would be good to, with the questions that you ask, to collect individual opinions first before everything gets thrown into a discussion and some of the information might get lost. So that's a good starting point. But then obviously you want people to share their opinions and get the extremes to not enter into a fight, but more into a debate on their points of view, and then ask them to come to a consensus. So that's those are very, very good conversations to have with your stakeholders. Now, obviously, all of these different methods, they all have their pros and their cons. So what is very important, however, across these different methods is that you are consistent in the questions that you will ask. And yes, you will have different questions on the side, but that basically the discussions and the surveys, the interviews, the focus groups, that all of them are anchoring on the same question. So this is to avoid that you're going to be comparing apples with pears, because at the end, the next step will be to bring all of those data, all of those feedbacks together into final scores. So it only works if you basically get the opinion on the same questions. Another tip that I would give is to combine different methods, because I've as we've seen before, each method has certain benefits and also certain drawbacks. But one method will actually compensate for the drawbacks of the others. So I would definitely recommend to use a combination of these different methods, if not all three of them, in order to generate the most robust results for your DMA. If you've read the EFRA guidelines on how to organize a DMA, then you will have noticed that the EFRA is actually suggesting a certain structure on how to ask questions. They have what they call subscores. So they want you to score questions on a sub-score level, which is scoring on the level of scope of an impact, scale, likelihood, the remediability of a certain impact, and all of those. Like those are, I mean, these are valid concepts when thinking about impact, but they are very hard to understand for someone who has no experience with this. Therefore, I would not recommend to apply this mechanism when you're doing surveys. Because explaining this concept of what is scope, what is scale, what is remediability, and all of that, it's too hard. People will not understand this when you're doing a survey. So there, I would strongly advise to stay away from that. However, when you're doing an interview or a focus group where you're able to have that conversation with someone, and when you notice that someone has quite some expertise in a certain area, then it might actually be very relevant to go to that level of detail and to apply those subscores as defined by EFRA. So that's where it actually would make sense. So it's bringing some pragmatism into the data collection process in order to make it work for you. And so EFRA has given these recommendations, but they also need to work for you and not against you. So this is what I would recommend when you're doing those data collection exercises. Now, moving on, there's a couple of questions which we're getting quite often from clients. And I took the liberty of sharing already 3 questions, and I would like to tackle them here with you because they are, I think, very relevant for everyone. And so a first question that we're often getting from clients is, well, if I know upfront that a certain topic is going to material, do I still need to talk to my stakeholders about it? So for example, I know that climate change is a material for my business. Do I still bother them with questions about climate change? Well, in fact, the first option could be, well, no, you don't bother them. And you basically take all of those questions that are linked to climate change, you take them out of your DMA process. But that's not what I would recommend, because it's actually taking a shortcut on what the DMA is all about. So it has happened. Clients have done this, and to me, it always made sense when they've done this. But they've always done this in a discussion with the auditor to get the pre-approval to take kind of that shortcut on the process. There is a second option that I'm a bigger fan of, which is to actually use your DMA process to define if a topic is really material or not, and to basically confirm your opinion. And that is using and engaging with a smaller subset of stakeholders and to ask their opinion. And most often that's an ESG expert group, so a small group of stakeholders within the company that are quite knowledgeable about ESG. And so you would ask them their opinion about climate change. They will potentially say, yes, very material. But then you don't need to bother too many other people. You don't need to bother your 500 other employees through the survey to collect this. So that would be my recommended approach, to reuse your DMA process to cover all of the ESRS topics. Another question that we're getting is what to do when your stakeholders are not available. So for example, you are selling Apple products or electronics, and Apple is a large supplier of your hardware that you're selling. Then getting an interview with Apple is going to be quite a challenge. And so um, how do you do that, right? How do you collect their inputs? So that's where we like to call in the principle of collecting data by proxy. So here in this particular case, you're not going to interact with the stakeholder directly, but you will be interacting with someone who's representing that stakeholder. And a good example of this is in the chocolate example that we gave before, when the NGO is speaking on behalf of the farmers, where unions, for example, speak on behalf of your workforce, or a scientist is speaking on behalf of nature. So that's all possible. We've had the cases where there was a more creative application of this, where basically a customer would or someone else would act as a proxy for another stakeholder based on some valid input representing that person. So there is flexibility within that process. The only element that we need to be careful and mindful of is that, especially when you're doing that data collection yourself, is to be very careful with bias, because you will always have a tendency to create bias in your favor, basically based on your own opinion. So what we've done is we've actually leveraged AI in order to collect data by proxy, because it's much easier to for AI to assess and to kind of take the stance of a certain organization or a certain person based on all of the scientific information available, to then respond to these questions and to make it a bit more um, uh, realistic with less bias. Another question that we often get is, do I need to involve all of my stakeholders? Well, the default answer would be yes, but the default answer is yes, you need to consider your full value chain, but considering does not necessarily mean that you need to talk to everyone. Like we saw in the chocolate example, you don't need to talk to the people that unload your beans, or the truck driver that gets stuff delivered to the shops. That does not make a lot of sense, right? So, but you need to consider the full value chain. But you can definitely zoom in on where it actually makes sense. What I would not recommend is to skip certain stakeholders that are indeed important, that are affected, but that you're actively ignoring. So that's something to definitely avoid. And that's also what auditors who will need to validate your process, that they will struggle with. So consider the full value chain, but it doesn't mean that you need to involve everyone. And I mentioned the auditors already before. Now, what I would, because all of the recommendations that I've shared are also based on our experience and basically going through many audits as well. And these are recommendations that have passed all of these auditor reviews. But my main tip would be to also remain pragmatic. And that your case, your situation will be unique. And if you're ever in doubt of if your process, if your approach is the right one, you can always validate this with an auditor to be reassured that at the end of the process that it will be a pass and you will not be stepped on the fingers for taking a shortcut here and there. So my tip would be pragmatic and still be in touch with your auditor in case of any doubts. Voila. These are all the main tips that I wanted to share. Maybe as a closing argument before I jump to questions, is that if you're ever curious about doing a DMA and how to best structure this, you can go to our website, you can try our sandbox, you can actually try it for free to see how the double materiality assessment could work for you. And we're also organizing a next webinar on September 11, where we're going to be looking at a customer testimonial. So someone who has actually gone through the process, cover it end to end, and really zoom in on some of the key decisions that we're taking along the process, the trade-offs that had to be made in order to make this quite efficient. So That's September 11. You will also get an invite for this or a link to subscribe to this. Let me quickly see if there's any questions on this. So I'm looking here at a first question from Alan, whether we have any tips on which type of stakeholders to combine in focus groups. That's a good point. So what you want to avoid in your focus group is that you put people together who all share the same opinion, because, well, if they all share the same opinion, then it will be a dull conversation, right? So it would be good to put people from different departments. If it's an internal focus group, put people from different departments together. But also when you're doing this with external people, is that there you focus it, for example, a bit more on customers there. So there it can be a bit more homogeneous. But when it's internal, I would definitely make sure that it's people with different opinions. So the fact that you would pull together customers and different customers of yours together, they will also have quite different opinions. They come from different backgrounds, different focus areas. So there I would go less exotic and not combine a customer with a supplier, with a regulator, because it will also be hard for them to get an understanding of and to basically come to consensus. So there would be a bit more homogeneous. Question of Bart: can you give an example of a focus group in the chocolate company? Well, it's a good question. I've not done a DMA for a chocolate company, so I cannot say what they would actually do. But what I can actually take a look at other clients in other industries, what they've done, and they've done exactly what I mentioned before. So internal focus groups, those were people from all different departments put together into a discussion. And then when it's external, then they really tie it more on one specific stakeholder group. So customers, suppliers. So that's how we've seen it organized. I know of other companies who have really mixed different profiles. So regulators with customers, with suppliers. But those are also focus groups that lasted a full day because it takes time to get an understanding of who these industries are, to share points of view. So it has been done before, but then it takes a lot more time. So we still prefer to have focus groups that last 2 hours max, but then you want to make sure that it's going to click and it's going to lead to results quite efficiently. Is the method, so the next question of Kobe, is the method to define the stakeholders the same for the new LSME, which is coming for SMEs? Well, so for the smaller enterprises and the double materiality assessment that is taking place there, it is following similar principles. But obviously, you will be more pragmatic in applying the legislation and applying the rules of organizing a DMA. So I would say yes, but there can be even a higher level of pragmatism as you're conducting your DMA. Another question from Alan: how exactly does Karomia use AI to act as a proxy for stakeholders? So I'll try to not give a technical answer and try to explain it as easy as possible. But so what we do is we have the different impacts, risks, and opportunities identified. And then what we'll do as a basis for everything that we generate is we'll use scientific knowledge, publicly available scientific knowledge about every statement and score it like this with that input. Now, so that's the most objective way of scoring those IRO statements. However, if you want to do it specifically on a stakeholder group, so imagine Apple. If you want Apple to fill out your survey bit, you will not be able to get people from Apple to fill it out. What we would then do is basically collect sustainability reports and statements from Apple so that we have an understanding of what is it that they care about in their sustainability reports. Like, what are the targets that they've set? What matters to them in their supply chain? Like, how do they want the customers to use their products? So all of that information will then feed to the AI, and then we'll present the AI with your sustainability questions, and then we'll ask the AI to report and to answer them as if they were Apple. So that's then how it works. Voila. So we're already 1 minute over time, so I don't want to take too much of your time. Thanks a lot, everyone, for joining. And if there's any other questions, please feel free to drop me an email. My contact details are on the screen. So so thanks a lot, everyone. Let's say have a lovely afternoon and hope to see you soon. Bye bye.